This podcast is brought to you by VinZero. VinZero pioneers solutions and services to the AEC and manufacturing industries to support net zero targets. Visit vinzero.com to learn more about how organisations design, build and solve through digitalisation. From VinZero to you, welcome to our Think Future podcast series. Each week we'll share conversations with industry leaders from around the world to find out how they're thinking future. Subscribe to VinZero Think Future for access to more episodes, interviews and profiles. Dr. Anne Kovacevic is the leader of Sustainable Buildings and Precincts at Mott MacDonald. Anne is an engineer and physicist with 25 years' experience in sustainable building design. As a recognised futures thinker, Anne believes that foresight and innovation skills are integral to achieving sustainable outcomes and is passionate about applying these techniques for long-term positive results. Anne joins us today to share her insights into the role of futures thinking in effectively designing the precincts of the future. Welcome to the program, Anne.
Thank you for having me.
And you've spent many years practicing futures thinking. What are the roles and responsibilities of a futures thinking specialist, and how do they help individuals and organisations navigate uncertainty and make informed decisions for the future?
Well, my core discipline's always been around sustainability, and generally sustainability focused on the built environment. And as sustainable professionals, we've really known for a number of decades a number of the things that we need to do. So we've been talking about climate change, we've been talking about sustainable design, and even over decades ago, we were talking about regenerative design and net positive design. So we had to do a lot of work with our clients, thinking about the visions that they could set and the sustainable futures that they could create. And what we've found is over the last 5 years that we've really turned the corner as far as sustainable development goes, and that clients realise it's not an optional extra, but it's something that they have to do. For sustainability, futures thinking has really evolved from vision setting to much more strategic pathway setting around how we can create adaptive pathways into different futures to navigate uncertainties.
So with that in mind, what is it that is most needed in the built environment right now?
So I think what we need to do is we need to think about all the possible uncertainties and really create robust and adaptable strategies to create these desirable futures. And I think as a foresight practitioner, what I find is that there's so much complexity out there that people struggle to understand how they can navigate all the different variables. And as a foresight practitioner and a sustainability practitioner, what I really tried to do is structure the uncertainty and provide a bit of a framework so that people can break down some of the different elements that they're dealing with, some of the different systems and some of the different problems that they need to navigate, and start to pull together thinking that is much more structured. And not only think about how each of those different systems might evolve, but also how they might evolve together and create sort of a symbiotic future. So as mentioned, I think we've wasted a lot of time not taking action. We really need to get started and really accelerate how we're moving towards a sustainable future. One of the things that I think is imperative is that we all work together. And one of the things that we've created this year is a Brisbane Futures Collaborative. So in collaboration with Dr. Kimberly Camras, we've been working together to pull together a number of different futures practitioners and just generally big picture thinkers. We get them together just to ideate around the future and share different methodologies that people use and different thinking so that we can work together to enable and accelerate sustainable design into the future. And we really like to think about how different professionals can work together and really create those futures that we want. One of the problems is that the rhetoric that we've had in the past is when we create sustainable design, we'll actually be missing out on something. And I think this is rhetoric that's been developed by fossil fuel companies to sort of say that sustainability is going to cause us to miss out on something. But when we connect with people, we can talk about the future and we can see the opportunities that are there to create new futures, ones that we want to create, and ones that we're really connected with nature, we have all the things that we want, and that we're not missing out on different elements. We're actually optimizing and having much more efficient and connected cities
And so you're leading the way with Mott MacDonald's approach to precincts. Can you share some practical examples of how you apply that futures thinking to precinct design?
So Mott MacDonald, my role as Sustainable Buildings and Precinct Lead, really focuses on how we can apply futures thinking and approaches to precincts. So we think of precincts as communities within a city that can have multiple people living, working them, they meet multiple needs. And this means that we might have a place to live, a place to work, a place to exercise, a place to connect, and also, most importantly, a place to connect with nature. And so precincts provide us a scale where we can think of all these different systems and how they work together. And then we can draw parallels to nature. We can think of an area in nature like, say, a rainforest. And when you think of an area of a rainforest with lots of different plants and species working together, they create a habitat where they can all thrive and work together symbiotically to create an area that overall has a regenerative effect.
So can you share some practical examples of how you apply futures thinking to precincts?
So we always try to look beyond buildings, and the projects at a precinct scale will offer a lot of opportunities because we've got a number of different systems working together, systems like energy, water, food, transport. When we think about them for just a building scale, we might be quite restricted, but we can create a lot more efficiencies when we think of different uses of precinct scale. So when we start to think about residential, commercial, health, community aspects that might be part of a precinct, you know that there's different load profiles that happen throughout the day and night that when we optimize these, we can get much more efficient outputs. And we also, most importantly, we need to think across systems. So when we think of the energy system, we need to think of how that interacts with all of our other examples. And so an example might be if we have organic waste collected from residential developments, we might be able to feed that into an anaerobic digester on site, which might produce gas, which can be used in the energy system, might also produce fertilizer, where we might have a community garden, and then other uses. So we're really creating the connection between these different systems. So one of the things we also do with precincts and futures thinking is we think about particularly what is the climate going to be in the future. And we know as we move forward, we're going to experience much higher temperatures and much more extreme weather conditions than we have in the past. And so one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is looking at in precincts, what is the thermal comfort in the areas between the buildings, and how can we make these overall places livable and comfortable. One of the things we do when we're designing is we work with a lot of the different engineers and consultants who are designing the precinct. And so we might be working in the early stages with, say, a water engineer, traffic engineer, client, and landscape design. And we will be designing for how can we maximize the precinct so that it's comfortable for what we need to design for now. But when we think about the future, we also know that some of the needs are going to adapt over time. So when we think towards the future, we know that currently we design for a lot of single-use car transport because that's what the current expectation is. But as we move forward, we know that we're going to have better access to public transport. We're going to have more options as far as pedestrian transport and other low-carbon transport options. And so when we design a precinct, we not only look at what the current design is, but how we can change that design as it evolves and as uses change. So we might design an area that currently has a road, but we might think how we can take that road out and pedestrianize that in the future.
So from a design perspective, that must introduce some complexities. How do you navigate through those?
So firstly in cities, we need to initially really think when we need to build and make sure we're not building unless we really, really need to, and looking for all opportunities to retrofit. And then secondly, we need a big focus on carbon emissions. So carbon has essentially become the currency that we think about. And we talk a lot about decarbonisation strategies, how we move away from fossil fuels, how we have circular strategies and use renewable technologies. So the goal is really that we can reduce the amount of carbon that we emit and get to a point where we're actually net positive in all of our cities. Carbon emissions are the cause of climate change, which is one of the 9 planetary boundaries. But what we need to remember is climate change is only one of the 9 systems that we need to stay within in order to maintain life on Earth. These systems have an upper limit defined by a planetary boundary that if we transgress this boundary, we'll end up in a zone of uncertainty. We're really unclear about their effects on human life.
So with the planetary boundaries that you're talking about, what is the fundamental concept behind these and how do they contribute to addressing global sustainability challenges for the built environment?
So essentially there are 9 different Earth systems that we need to stay within in order to maintain life on Earth. If we think about climate change, it's one of the key Earth systems because it has a tremendous effect on all of the other boundaries. But we have to remember that we can't only focus on carbon emissions. So climate change is the first of the boundaries, but then we think about other elements like biosphere and integrity. So this used to be known as loss of biodiversity. And here we recognise that we need to have a diverse range of species on the planet in order to keep the ecosystems functioning. And then we move on to the third planetary boundary, which is freshwater use. And freshwater is actually only 2.5% of the total water on Earth. And this is the water that's in the water cycle. The fourth planetary boundary is land system change. And as you can imagine, our cities have really encroached on our forests, and agriculture has caused a large amount of deforestation as well. And therefore, we've really changed the balance of land use on our planet, which is creating a lot of issues. The fifth planetary boundary is biochemical flows, and this relates to nitrogen and phosphorus. And these are used in fertilizers. And what we find that with agriculture is that we've used way too much fertilizer, which runs off into our waterways and accumulates and causes things like algal blooms that starve marine life. The sixth planetary boundary is atmospheric aerosol loading. And so this is essentially pollution, not only fossil fuels. This is also caused by natural occurrences like volcanoes, but causes particular matter to form in the atmosphere, which is disruptive to human health and health of other species. The seventh planetary boundary is novel entities, and this is essentially all of the man-made elements out there. And they've actually recently decided that we really need to set this boundary to 0. And this means that we really need to get rid of all man-made substances that are harmful to human and natural health. The eighth planetary boundary is ocean acidification, and this is very intrinsically linked to climate change because it's linked to the amount of carbon dioxide that the ocean absorbs. And when oceans absorb carbon dioxide, they actually get more acidic. And finally, the last planetary boundary is stratospheric ozone depletion. And of all of the planetary boundaries, this is probably the good news story, because this is where we can see that previously we noticed that there was a hole in the ozone layer, and there was a global agreement, the Montreal Protocol, to reduce the refrigerants that were causing this hole. And since then, we've been able to regenerate the ozone layer so that it's no longer transgressed that planetary boundary. So to sum up, the planetary boundary really helped policymakers, scientists, and society understand the different boundaries that we need to work within in order to operate sustainably.
Are you looking for a digitalisation and net zero partner to help you achieve your goals? Join the thousands of AEC and manufacturing customers globally who have turned to VinZero to start their journey toward a net zero future. With 32 offices around the world, VinZero can connect you to the right technologies and workflow processes so you can maintain your competitive position and increase profitability. VinZero has an industry expert to help you navigate the best pathway forward wherever you are on your digitalisation and net zero journey. Visit vinzero.com to find out more. Mott McDonald's has been recognised as the industry leader in carbon standards. What do the actors within the industry need to do in order to effectively integrate carbon management across their projects and activities?
So we really need to start with carbon emissions. We really need to understand a baseline of where emissions are at. So each of the different players in the market needs to understand what their emissions are. And we break this into 3 different scope emissions, and a lot of people will have heard of these. So firstly, scope 1 emissions, which are your direct emissions. Scope 2 emissions, which are related to the electricity that we use and how that is produced. And thirdly, the indirect emissions, which is where it gets really, really complicated, because we're starting to look at their entire supply chains and work out how all of the emissions within that supply chain can be abated. So once we've initially looked at and understood the emissions, we need to start thinking about how to deal with all of these different emissions. We do this through setting targets and working out how we're going to deal with those emissions at each stage of a project. And this is where we really start to apply our systems thinking so that we can have considered approaches to the life cycle of carbon.
And in terms of understanding what the carbon approaches are or measuring that whole of life carbon approaches, MOTMAC have actually developed their own platform. So how is digitalisation playing a part in setting these standards for MOTMAC on their own projects and potentially for their customers as well?
Yeah, so digitalisation is really imperative to understanding the complexity of the data that's out there. So we know that we're trying to analyse all this carbon across a number of different elements, and we can only really do that by utilising some of the tools that are out there. And you mentioned Mott McDonald's approach to carbon management, and we've developed what's called the MOATA carbon portal, and this allows us to calculate embodied emissions and optimize solutions for carbon emissions. So this is something that we can use for businesses. This is something that we can use for projects, something we can use to look at the entire supply chain. And I think the key part of the MOATA carbon portal for me is that we try to do this at a really early stage so that we can either read in a bill of quantities or use an upfront digital model to understand the materials that are involved in a project, and then we apply a different standard to those emissions, and we can quite quickly get an understanding of the full embodied emissions in a project, and be making decisions really quickly at the start of a project as to where the best bang for buck is as far as reducing carbon emissions throughout the life cycle.
And MOTMAC were also the first engineers to be recognised as net zero and to achieve PAS 2080 standard. What does that mean?
Well, I think the thing that we always try to do at Mott McDonald is really make sure that we're living what we're asking others to do. And so we've made sure that when we recommend that people are net zero or companies are net zero, that we really knew how to do that ourselves. So we made sure we understood our emissions and then worked out a way to offset anything that was outstanding. And then with the PAS 2080, this is an international standard that we actually collaborated to develop the standard for, so that we create a streamlined approach to how we deal globally with emissions in infrastructure projects.
So how does a tool like MOATA unlock social, economic and environmental value through the insight that it provides?
Well, I think the key with MOATA is being able to provide something that is standardized and open to a lot of different groups to be able to input and understand their projects early. And so that really drives downstream approaches that are really beneficial for projects and outcomes in general. So the more people that are using the MOATA carbon portal, the more we're getting better outcomes downstream. And one of the key things about the MOATA carbon pool is it's sector agnostic, which means we're able to help pretty much everyone with their carbon journey and then make sure that we're getting outcomes that are transparent and traceable.
So, Anne, as a futures thinker, what aspect of Mott MacDonald's approach towards sustainability inspires you the most?
Well, working at Mott MacDonald, I'm really surrounded by engineers and scientists who are relentlessly striving for the best outcome. So whenever we're looking to solve a problem, we're always looking to apply technical analysis to back up our assumptions. And often in other places, I've seen sort of a strategic thinking, but it's not backed up by that those digital tools and the analytics that we apply at Mott MacDonald. So often what I'm inspired by is that it's really important to us that we're trying to solve these complex problems using full systems analysis and making sure that these backed up with technically correct analysis.
So as we close out today's conversation, when you think future about the built environment as a whole or about the precincts that you're designing, what is it that excites you the most?
So I'm really excited by how sustainability has really come such a long way. You know, we've known that we need to change for such a long time, but we've really just recently got the computational tools and the computational power as well to be able to understand our city systems and design sustainable outcomes. What I love is that there's a real momentum behind achieving the sustainable outcomes. So we've seen a lot of great examples, particularly coming out of places like Europe, where resources are recognised to be limited, and they've really been driving a lot of move to sustainability. But what I would say excites me, particularly in Brisbane, is that we have elements such as the Brisbane Olympic Games that recognises as having the potential to be a catalyst for change and really promoting sustainable outcomes. So when I look at something like a big event that can really change the track of where we're going, I think that's really, really exciting.
Well, Anne, thank you for joining us today to share your insights and forethoughts on what it takes to build a sustainable precinct of the future. And we look forward to hearing more about Mott Mac's work in Australia.
Thanks so much.
This podcast was brought to you by VinZero. VinZero help the AEC and manufacturing industries keep pace with digital change and achieve their technological and sustainability leadership goals. VinZero is a company that cares about creating and building a better world. Together, we are working with industry and environmental experts, providing forums and platforms through our VinZero Think community to create conversations that matter to our future generations. We invite you to join in the conversation and participate in our Think community. Like and subscribe to Think Future to stay up to date with the latest innovations and conversations as we take AEC and manufacturing around the world closer to zero. You can download our podcasts at vinzero.com or from your favourite podcast platform. From VinZero Think Future, thanks for listening.